Welcome to the Church Leadership Podcast, where we are all about encouraging and equipping local church leaders to be disciples who make disciples. With your hosts, Mark Gainey and Andy Frazier. In each episode, Andy and Mark have authentic conversations that help you grow as you lead the local church. Thanks for joining the podcast, and be sure to subscribe to the show. Here is today's episode.
Welcome to today's episode of the Church Leadership Podcast. We're so glad you are here. This episode, like every other episode, is aimed to encourage and equip you, the local church leader, to be a disciple who makes disciples. And we love these conversations that we get to have with church leaders, and they're always encouraging to us. And I know that you'll be encouraged and equipped as well. And so, Andy, I'm excited about today's conversation.
Absolutely. Anytime this guy takes time out of his schedule to spend with us, it is a blessing. And we are delighted to have Dr. Crain with us, the executive director of the Birmingham Metro Baptist Association, who has been on the podcast before. And we've received a lot of positive feedback from Chris's previous time with us. So, Chris, thank you for taking the time to hang out with us and talk about some important stuff that's going to help some church leaders today.
It's my pleasure. It's always just great to be with you guys. And thank you so much for pouring into us. I love your podcast and appreciate what you do.
Well, I think this is your third episode, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
So we love you a lot, obviously.
Well, you're gluttons for punishment.
That's right. So the first time was in person. I remember we did everything in person. I think the second time was Zoom, but we're so thrilled that you're here. And so when we're recording this episode, it's right before Christmas time, 2025. And, we're all in the throes of Christmas time. And what I find is no matter how hard I try to clear my schedule and to make things simple and light, it's always the busiest time of year. And when that happens, a lot of times in our lives, in our families, and in our churches, other things begin to, rear their ugly head sometimes. Conflict and difficulty and challenges. And so we just wanted to start our conversation today with you, Chris, to talk about just that, conflict in church and when conflict happens and what to do when it does. So share with us a little bit about what you've discovered, when conflict happens, and then, we'll kind of break it down how to address it. But, when does it tend to happen in churches?
Well, that's a super question, because this time of year, I get text messages, calls from lay leaders and also staff members. It just seems like that this time of year is pretty heavy for conflict. And what I used to do as a pastor and what I do now as a leader here in our association is I try to disseminate a list of times when conflict is likely to happen in your staff or your church. And here's what I found. When you're in the middle of Christmas, when there's a lot of activities going on that are outside the norm, or even in Easter or other times on the church calendar when there's a lot going on, in the busiest times in your church life, that's when people are certainly in contact with each other. There are a lot of people who have strong opinions. So those are times when you need to be aware of conflict. I'm going to give you a few others just to start the conversation. Maybe you're in the midst of a stewardship campaign or budget season. So budget season is often wrapping up right at the end of November. Usually you're going to vote on that as a church, at least in our tradition. And so that's another time when you're going to have conflict. Also, when you're adding staff or you're adjusting staff, maybe you're reassigning staff, that's a time of conflict. Or when the pastor is not around, maybe he's on vacation, he's taking some time away. So those are some times. I could give you some more, but those would be in the top 5 or 6 times in your church life that you need to be aware. And normalizing the conversation, Mark, making sure that, people on your staff, your leadership know about that. I used to just send this list out and sort of annotated list, and I could send it to your viewers, but just it was good because it helped to normalize the fact that we need to be looking out, we need to be aware.
Chris, I think you just hit the nail on the head in identifying some markers to look out for in church conflict, but also I think this could translate directly into a whole episode on marriage counseling. So
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely.
all of those things I think are markers to look out for in your marriage or in your family gatherings during the holiday season. So when you put people who love each other in close quarters and you're talking about things, man, it can get tense in a hurry. But thank goodness for the ability to look at conflict as an opportunity versus something to avoid. And you've dealt with that a lot over the years, talking about how conflict can be utilized as an opportunity in your church to address needed things, to make necessary changes, to deal with difficult people. So those are some important things to look out for in your church, especially this time of year, because tensions rise high. Everybody's, like you said, they're stressed about the holidays and their busy schedule, and you throw in money and you throw in personnel, and then you throw in just the crazy schedules that we have going on in our lives and our churches, and it can be tense.
Absolutely. Even good things can cause conflict. Like I was talking not too long ago with a staff, they just got through a major emphasis in a project in their church. And now, because of the vacuum, where they had been focused on this for so long, that this vacuum that's there now of time and energy that they had been putting into this, now they're starting to see some conflict because of that. So even when you complete a season of busy activity, it can cause conflict. So not to discourage you, but in a fallen world, conflict can come from just about anything.
That is so true. And just being real, we know that Annie and I both have walked through more than our share, I think, of conflict over the years, but it can be a gut punch. It can be discouraging. I think, anybody who is, leading change better be prepared, because everything you mentioned really is a type of change. And if we're called to lead change in our churches, organizations, we're going to experience conflict. And so, a long time ago, my gut reaction, my default was to respond emotionally. My first response would be to blow up or to take things personally. And so how can we confront conflict? How can we address the things we're trying to change in our cultures, in our churches that we're leading, without doing it, without making it combative, without making it personal? How do we do that?
Well, Hebrews 12:15 tells us to see that no root of bitterness rises up in us. And we have to guard our hearts, Mark. And a lot of it, for me, especially as a younger leader, I hope I'm getting better at this. I saw any dissension or any different viewpoint as a threat. And I've had to work through that in my own leadership. And thankfully, God has always seemingly placed me into environments. I personally am very conservative. I have very fundamental views about the Bible and the authority of God's word, and even just a lot of issues. But I've been in context just about my whole ministry where they're, under the umbrella of what's orthodox and what we believe in our family of faith. There have been a lot of different opinions, whether that's over some nuances of salvation and how that works out, and or maybe the way the church is organized. And I've had to learn how to deal with people who view things a lot differently and still fall within the realm of, our church family. And so I've seen that as a challenge. I've seen it as something that's helped me to grow, in iron sharpening iron. But I remember I met with a pastor several years ago, and there were several in his church that saw this specific theological issue different than he did, and he just could not put his arms around them. And eventually, unfortunately, it led to them feeling alienated because he had sort of distanced himself. And that was a very negative thing. And so he had a mass exodus. At least I would say a third of the church left. And that was unfortunate, which from an outside perspective, of course, I don't know everything, but seemingly he could have worked through that and put his arms around them and saw the beauty of the diversity there. Maybe he could have seen that as a healthy tension instead of as a threat. So, that's something that I try to keep in mind with regards to conflict is I don't take it personal. I can look at diversity as a positive thing, especially when it's not over a fundamental of the faith.
Chris, that's good. And, you just mentioned a while ago some common times or common things that may be happening in the life of your church where you can kind of predict that tension may lead to conflict. You just mentioned maybe even diversity of beliefs, maybe just some uncertainty of what others believe, and you can be under the same umbrella. And I mean, if you believe that salvation comes by faith through grace in Jesus Christ alone, there's a whole lot of wiggle
Absolutely.
room there that we
Yes.
could agree to disagree on. But what about a church that may not be sure of its mission? That's kind of a major leading factor to conflict. I mean, you have different people who have their own agenda, what they think the mission of the church should be, versus a church who's united, who has a clear direction and vision, and the leadership is bought into the mission. Tell us a little bit about what happens when that's absent, or when that's not as black and white and clear as it should be.
I'm going to mention a very obscure book. A few guys know about this book. This is a guy that was from the Southeast, and I think he's gone on to be with the Lord now. His name is Herb Hodges, and he wrote a book called Tally Ho the Fox. And strange name, but the premise of the book is that it's just a visual. There are these hunting dogs, and they're all fighting each other. They're just rolling around the dirt. They're biting each other. And then all of a sudden, there at the tree line, there's a fox. And, these dogs were fighting each other. They notice the fox, and then they all turn, and then they start pursuing that fox together. So, and he said for the church, the fox at the tree line is the Great Commission. And that we do so much better at walking step in step with each other when we understand that we have a mission to do. There's the mission of God. He is at work in the world in his kingdom. He is drawing people to himself. He is growing his church, but there's the mission more specifically of the church. And that's the mission that Christ gave us in all four Gospels and the book of Acts, that we need to be making disciples. And when we get focused on that, I think that we can walk together even in very difficult times because we have a common mission. I've always took it as a matter of first priority when I go to an organization. I did it here at the BMBA to work on the mission statement. And so I came in immediately within the first 3 months. We had worked through the mission statement, and our mission statement is pretty simple. We're here to encourage, equip, and engage biblically faithful churches in the Great Commission for God's glory. And I could say that in my sleep. Our staff can say it in their sleep. We know that. We know our 5 core values. Very simply, we are about truth. We're in touch. We're on mission. We're on purpose, and we're for the church. Those are our core values. I think you have to get to that place where it's not just something on your bulletin or your worship guide or your website. It's sort of like you've got the flu and you want everybody to catch it. I mean, it's just a part of who you are. It's like a virus. You're passing it on at every turn. So it's important that we have a very clear mission statement and the core values that underpin it, or you will have conflict. There is no doubt in my mind.
That's great. And truly, as pastors, often we think our people get it sometimes. And, when conflict arises, we realize, oh, they're not quite with us on mission. Even last year, I was talking before we hit record, we had some conflict in our church. And really, it was over this. The fox in our church has been the mission, but, there were a couple families that they had a different fox, and they were chasing it politically. And when we didn't, step in line with their political viewpoint, publicly and verbally from stage, they decided they were going to take their ball and go home. And, it's when those things happen, you can say that you're about the mission, but when those things happen and you stand firm on the mission, that speaks volumes to your people. They're like, you know what? This is a tough time, but he's serious. They're serious. I mean, this mission does matter, right? And I think that can, while it may be difficult, it can really reap huge benefits down the road. And so I do want to kind of use that as a jumping off point to my next question, Chris, and that is, there are definitely people watching and listening that are going through some conflict right now. And again, if this airs, around Christmas time, certainly that's probably part of it, but human nature, we're going to have conflict. And so what would be some things that you would just encourage folks to do like today, right now, as opposed to giving up, because we're seeing that a lot. We're seeing a lot of people in ministry just leave the ministry. What are some things that they can do just to take a breath and to, really center themselves back on that mission?
That's great. It's a really good question. I was reading just the account of the fall in Genesis chapter 3, verse 10, where Adam hid himself from God. And that is our tendency in our sinful nature, is to hide from what we know is true and right, or even just to alienate ourselves. And really, there are two major approaches that we have to conflict. When things happen, it's not pretty. So we will either avoid it, we will pull away from it, or we will attack. And those are two extremes. But really, I think the best way to deal with conflict is not to avoid it, and certainly not to attack. Attacking others is not really what Jesus would have us to do. We read the Sermon on the Mount. We're to love people, and we're to try to walk with them and care about them. Really, what we need to do is approach. And we don't need to avoid conflict. We need to approach. The worst thing that happens with staff and pastors and leaders, in my view, is I see them distance themselves from those that they have an issue with. I remember reading about Abraham Lincoln's leadership strategy and how he staffed the government, and that was to include his enemies even. And I think sometimes we think that the best way to deal with people that we have an issue with, or we think that we don't see eye to eye with, is to push them out into the margins of our lives. I was listening this morning, this guy was critiquing this. He was a charismatic prophet type person who was telling his listeners if there's anybody that's negative in your life, if there's anybody that doesn't agree with your vision, that you need to block them, you need to cancel them and get them out of your life. And I think that a lot of people hear that kind of rhetoric and they welcome that because it feeds our sinful capacity. We want to avoid people that don't agree with us. But I would caution anybody that's watching this podcast to not do that, especially if you're a leader. You have to learn how to deal with people who are different than you. And so do not avoid, don't attack, but be an approacher. And of course, we know what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 4, don't let the sun go down on your anger. It's not a good thing. Maybe there's a 2-day cooling off period when maybe there's something that's really hot. Maybe there's something that's just very emotional. We need to calm down a little bit. But beyond that, I really don't think there's any value in shutting people out of our life that really we have a conflict with necessarily, especially if they're in our leadership. We have to deal with them. So that would be the number one thing I would tell them straight out of the gate.
That's
awesome.
Great, Chris. I mean, I'm thinking about Galatians, where we're told not to bite and devour one another. That's essentially what church conflict is. We're not embracing and loving each other, even though we have differences. We're attacking, or we're running from those people. And genuine Christ-centered community is not pushing people out, is bringing people in, and especially those who have differences of opinions. We can have people at our table who are key leaders in our church, and we can have difference of opinions on things, and that's okay. As long as we come back to the mission and come back to the centrality of the gospel in our lives and our ministries, it's okay, because we're going to be selfish and have our own agendas and motives at times. But if we lay that down at the foot of the cross and recognize it's all about God's glory and our church is good versus what I will, or me, mine, a lot of that conflict can be resolved in a healthy way. I'm grateful, Chris, for all of your wisdom and experience in these areas. As Mark mentioned earlier, this is not like knowledge you've gained from just reading books or talking to people. This is stuff that when you've been in the throes of ministry and in the trenches and you've experienced the hardships and the hurts, you can either grow bitter or get better. I know that's a cheesy saying, but it's very, very true. You can learn from it and learn how to redeem that. And I'm thankful for how God has done that in your life and how God's honoring and blessing the ministry you have to help pastors and churches through difficult times.
Well, it's a pleasure to serve. I think one thing I've tried to learn over the last few years is to know what, I've talked about not avoiding, but sometimes when you have someone that you love, maybe someone on your team, and there's something that they do, it's a mistake. There's a verse that was brought to my attention from Proverbs 19, verse 11, and it says, "Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is to his glory to overlook an offense." There are times when you just need to let it go, So I do want to say that to follow up on what I shared a moment ago. That doesn't mean that you have to point out every problem. Sometimes it's good to just say, this is not a pattern in their life. This is not a habitual issue. This is not something that's stopping our progress here in mission. It's just something I need to get over it. So I think that's something I'm trying to learn right now, Andy. I've got a lot more to learn. I started in helping churches manage conflict years ago as a seminary student. I wanted to study about church conflict and how to deal with it because of some things that had happened in my home church. It really impacted me. And so I began to call around and talk to denominational leaders, and they all said, "Why are you calling us? You got the best guy perhaps in the whole convention, in the SBC, right there in your own state. His name is Dale Huff." And so I started to go and learn from him. I listened to some of his teaching on this and read everything that he wrote about it. And so that really got me on this path of learning how to help churches walk through conflict.
Yeah, and what you mentioned, sometimes letting things go, that's grace in action. It's what Jesus has done for us. And that's what we have to model to others. I would, I think one thing I would add to what you were talking about, I think that's so important that we don't isolate those who may be opposed to what we're trying to do. In fact, I would say most often, those people who oppose you are the ones who can be the biggest proponents of what you're trying to do if you could just help them understand the why and the mission. Although there are times when you just won't, and you just got to decide to love them and maybe not give them a platform, but love them anyway. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Chris, man, it is always a joy, and it is always an encouragement to spend time with you, not just on the podcast, but just to hang out with you. And so I know it's a crazy time of year, so thank you again for taking time to talk with me and Andy about something that's really vital.
It's my pleasure. Thank you guys for having me.
Well, we hope everybody on this podcast has been encouraged and equipped like Mark and I have, just having a conversation with Chris today. So we love doing this podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining in. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Help us spread the word about the podcast by sharing on socials too. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.